Welcome to the third panel this afternoon. And we're gathering to talk about Southeast Asia and ASEAN in ways that build on what happened in the first panel this morning, but with a spotlight on Southeast Asia in the context of Canadian priorities and interests, but that go beneath the surface. I'm fascinated that the title of our whole gathering relates to Indo-Pacific, something we can debate, but the word strategic, and that strategic has an economic, commercial dimension to it. It also has a geopolitical and political security dimension. The Indo-Pacific strategy puts Southeast Asia in a central position in the kind of landscape of Canadian priorities and interests. And it's putting it in a new way. There are many people in this room who have worked in with Southeast Asia for goodly parts of their lives or careers. We have several high commissioners and others who are here who dealt with Southeast Asia and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in the era of the Asia-Pacific. And from a strategic perspective, if this meeting had been held 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and this same topic used to come up frequently, we would speak about Southeast Asia, ASEAN in a strategic perspective, as it related to some of the commercial issues, how we advance our economic interests. But it had a strategic dimension in Asia-Pacific, which heavily focused on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as an important multilateral organization, but ASEAN as an organization that reached out across the Asia-Pacific region. In economic terms, through the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Enterprise, but through enterprises, new institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum, like the East Asia Summit. ASEAN was seen as an important part of the architecture, not just for Southeast Asia, but for a broader Asia-Pacific region. Well, we're gathering today in the Indo-Pacific era. And in the Indo-Pacific era, where great power competition has resumed in an intensive way, where a strategic rivalry or competition, depends on your point of view, between the United States and China is reshaping the political dynamics in international institutions, where it is reshaping the alignments and foreign policies of countries around the world, but in Southeast Asia in some very interesting ways. So I hope you will enjoy the discussion, the panel this afternoon, where we're going to talk principally about foreign policy and geopolitics. And we're going to be drawing a distinction throughout between Southeast Asia as an agglomeration of individual countries, places, peoples, and ASEAN, the formal organization. Because one of the premises we're going to be examining is that ASEAN, which we have taken in some ways for granted, or at least as a regular part of the landscape, is facing some severe challenges, some of them generated by a US-China conflict in which countries are, even in a context of multi-alignment or non-alignment, are facing choices that are very difficult in defense and security and increasingly in economic issues as the economic scene changes, as the United States is abandoning some of the rules and enterprises, institutions of an earlier period. So there's that going on, but there's a lot going on inside Southeast Asia itself. Some very difficult problems that are not being resolved and that are becoming more dangerous for the people directly involved, but for the region. We'll be talking about Myanmar as part of our discussion today. We will be raising some issues around South China Sea. So, we have three panelists. Excuse me. We have three panelists, two of them on the stage with me, and I'll introduce them in a few moments. But one of them is coming in from California, Elina Noor, who works for the Carnegie Endowment on International Peace. Several of you in the room know her. She's been good enough to join us today to help us cut into the ASEAN question. This is the association, the dynamics within it, the challenges that it is facing, and the direction that it is trying to take in the context of this Indo-Pacific moment and era. Elina, welcome. Can you hear us?
I can indeed, and I hope you can hear me loud and clear.
Yeah, we can. I wanted to put a question to you to open the discussion. In this year, coming year, Malaysia is going to be the chair of ASEAN at a time when there are severe internal challenges in ASEAN, countries rowing their boats in somewhat different directions, and the overlay of a US-China competition that is trying to influence ASEAN in some important ways, in important ways. Elina, can you lead us into the discussion on what you expect from Malaysia in this year of its chairship of ASEAN?
Thank you, Paul. I wish I could be there with you in person, on stage at the panel. It seems as though there are quite a number of really cool events happening in cold Canada this month that I'm missing out on. As the young ones say, I have a FOMO, fear of missing out. But I'm actually quite happily ensconced in warmer California weather, as you pointed out. But let me get to you.
Didn't come? Is that the reason you're not here in person, because you were afraid of the snow?
I would love to roll in the snow. Unfortunately, it's due to other reasons that I am not able to join you. But thank you for having me virtually. I appreciate it. So let me try to get to your question, Paul. And I think I'd like to start by double-clicking or double-tapping on the distinction that you drew between Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And I think as obvious as it may seem to many of us who have worked on the region, in the region for a good number of years, it's an important distinction to draw because within Southeast Asia, of course, countries compete with each other, whether for investment or for other reasons, including overlapping claims in the South China Sea, as you pointed out, Paul, in your introductory remarks. But within ASEAN is where states work together, and they work together quite well, actually, in the economic pillar. They don't always play together or work together so well within the political security pillar. Certainly, ASEAN hasn't been moving at a pace that every member or every other person in the region has been comfortable with. And I think we've seen a number of instances. You pointed out Myanmar, for example, South China Sea as well, where countries have been pulled in different directions or have chosen to take different directions in their foreign policy approaches. And I think this point about where ASEAN can be more effective in the political security pillar is one that's been consuming many of us in the region. It's always entertaining to me to see how people outside of ASEAN have a lot of hopes and a lot of optimism about how ASEAN works. And within the region, we always engage in hand-wringing and a lot of angst about how ASEAN can be more relevant, how ASEAN can be more central for its own people. Let me get to my second point. I have 3 points. The first point was about this distinction that I think we have to bear in mind. The second point leads off from that first point, which is that following on from the topic of our panel, Southeast Asia being a pivot point, I think this pivot implies a sense of dynamism and flexibility within ASEAN as a grouping, as well as within the region writ large. And what this means is that Southeast Asian countries separately on their own turn to different powers for different reasons at different times. But ASEAN as a whole, collectively, under Malaysia's chairmanship this year, I think will also be led to explore different opportunities with different groupings in different regions. So, for example, the ASEAN and the Gulf Cooperation Council meeting that I believe was initiated last year is going to be expanded as proposed by Malaysia under this year to include China as well. So it will be an ASEAN, GCC, and China meeting that will be scheduled sometime during Malaysia's chairmanship. And part of this, maybe a lot of this, has to do with the fact that there is this sharpening US-China divide that is bifurcating the world in a way that discomforts many ASEAN states. And so the exploration of closer ties with other regions is one way that Malaysia is going to effect its chairmanship under the theme inclusivity and sustainability. That's on the geopolitical front. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty as the US gets ready to welcome back President Trump into the White House. And his lineup within the cabinet shows that he will be taking quite an aggressive approach towards China. And this will, of course, have reverberations throughout ASEAN. So one of the ways I think Malaysia is going to try to buffer against that is by diversifying ASEAN's own relations with other regions, because I think the region is slowly beginning to understand that the lines between the political and security, economic, as well as other pillars, or one other pillar really, sociocultural pillar, those lines are not as clear and distinct as they were before. So ASEAN no longer has the luxury of treating each one separately from the other. Third and final point is that although there is a sense that there is regional uncertainty brewing, particularly because of the US-China competition within the region, there are disturbances to peace outside the region that ASEAN needs to be very much aware of. And you've seen, for example, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia taking a very strong, assertive, sometimes discomforting stance from the Western point of view on what is going on in Gaza. And I think there's a real fear or concern that what is happening in West Asia or the Middle East, depending on where you stand, is going to have knock-on effects, particularly with the rise of terrorism once again back in the region. So while we may be focused on just Southeast Asia and the wider region of Asia writ large, I think within ASEAN, Malaysia is also quite apprised of what is going on in West Asia, the Middle East, and its potential negative effects on ASEAN peace and stability. So let me just pause there. Thank you.
Let me come back to Elina on one small point. Well, maybe it's a big point. And it's the matter of, you talked about Malaysia's vision of finding connections on issues and with partners outside of ASEAN and outside of the Asia-Pacific world, Middle East and Africa. I guess there are some who are concerned that in fact it's an internal fragmentation within ASEAN that is of concern. And that is some of the bilateral relationships, Malaysia and Vietnam, for example, their new comprehensive strategic partnership, but also many laterals. ASEAN has been an inclusive organization in philosophy, but in many laterals, which can be organized without everyone participating. Is this trend towards fragmentation going to harm ASEAN fundamentally? Can it shake the pillars of the association?
I believe that it can if it's not managed well. I know there are many other colleagues within ASEAN who feel that minilateralism or manilateralism is the way to go, simply because ASEAN has proven to be ineffective in the political security realm. I do have high hopes for ASEAN unity and centrality still, as critical as I am of it. But this trend towards minilaterals, plurilaterals is, particularly in the political security realm, is of concern to me. And if not managed well, I fear that there will be leaders, and we're seeing some activist leaders in office right now in Southeast Asia, who may be tempted to go off into these different directions?
Okay, well, we'd like you to be the Secretary General of ASEAN and to manage this issue effectively. Let's go to other members of the panel. Professor Noor Truong is a professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, assistant professor, and is a representative of a kind of new generation of Southeast Asian intellectuals and professors who has a wonderful background. She speaks Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Chinese, and is part of that generation of people who are not just a country specialist, but deal with problems and issues in different locations. Welcome. And I've essentially, because of the really interesting work you've done on Cambodia and Vietnam in particular, if you could paint a picture of what is going on in that relationship. In Southeast Asia, there's multiple relationships, but this is a particularly interesting one for Canadians who had a long history in Vietnam through the International Control Commission and its successor in Cambodia around the human security agenda and peace building. But on Vietnam, Cambodia. And one special dimension of this issue now is how each of those countries is managing what Elina told us is the fundamental challenge of the United States and China. How are those two countries dealing with China, and what can we learn from it?
Thank you so much, Paul, for the question and also for the very generous introduction. I don't speak all those languages in equal degree of fluency, to be very transparent. But the question that you asked is a very important one. How do countries in South Asia actually navigate this relationship, right? This US-China competition. And that's what I want to focus on, particularly from the perspective of countries in South Asia themselves. How do they see security? You know, the title of our panel has the word security in it, right? But how do countries like Vietnam, Cambodia actually see through the lens of security, not through the lens of how the US sees it or how Canada sees it, but how do they see it? And Vietnam is a particularly quite important, but also very, I think, telling case of the fact that Southeast Asian countries can be very pragmatic. They can also be very engaged in apparently paradoxical behavior that appear to be difficult to understand, that appear to be contradictory, and yet it makes perfect sense if you see them through the lens of the countries themselves. And by country, I focus particularly here the perspective of the ruling regimes, right? Not necessarily people, so civil society actor, human, different groups, but particularly the ruling government leadership regime themselves. As you know, Vietnam and China have had a very complicated history, as well as relationship over the years, including the South China Sea, right? But security for the Vietnamese communist regime is first and foremost about regime security. Regime security, meaning the stronghold of the Vietnamese Communist Party in power. And so through that lens, it helps us to understand why Vietnam continues to have very close relationship with China politically on the one hand. So for example, Vietnam has undergone a very destabilizing, or from the outside view, it might appear very destabilizing, right? The previous General Secretary, Nguyen Phu Trọng, who has been in leadership for 3 terms, which is unprecedented for Vietnam. The precedent is that General Secretary of the party is only allowed to have 2 terms. There's a term limit, right? And the latest General Secretary, Nguyen Phu Trọng, actually violated that institutional norm by holding on to a 3rd term. And yet he passed away suddenly in just this year, and then replaced by current General Secretary To Lam, who is the former Minister of Public Security in Vietnam. So to go through all of that is to kind of give you the context of who's in power in Vietnam currently. And there's also a new president who is from the army. He's an army general. And for both of them, one of their very first visits after they came to power or their position is to China, right? So one of the very first visits that General Secretary To Lam made was to China. And even before that, before General Secretary Nguyen Phu Trọng formed, a comprehensive strategic partnership with the U.S., it also visited China. And the Ministry of Public Security of Vietnam also frequently visited with Ministry of Public Security in China, strengthening the relationship, strengthening the coordination, exchanging experience on how to maintain political security, regime security. And yet, another point I want to make is, at the same time, these are also regimes that or can be sensitive to domestic pressures from below. Hence, you can still have a Vietnam that is close to China on the one hand, but still push for ASEAN to be more assertive, right, in its statement by including, referencing the ruling with the Philippines and so on. You can still have a Vietnam who actually revoked a bill that was going to establish special economic zones along the coast of Vietnam, a very strategic location, and that would lease land up to 99 years. That was then perceived as primarily catering to China. But that generated widespread protests, one of the largest waves of protests in Vietnam 2018, nationwide, to the point that the Vietnamese Communist government then revoked that bill. There's an example of how it was sensitive, or could be sensitive to domestic pressure, the link between foreign policy on the one hand and domestic politics on the other hand. In the same vein, Cambodia as well. One of the latest development is in, I think, August of this year, Cambodia pulled out of the Cambodia-Laos-Vietnam CLV DTA Development Triangle Area, which is an agreement among Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, all three countries with very close relationship, historically, communist roots, etc., that has been established since 1999 and been in effect since 2004. And yet, due to widespread reaction, protests, both domestically and abroad. In South Korea, there were protests as well from Cambodian diaspora against Cambodia's relationship with Vietnam. So Cambodia actually pulled out in reaction to that. So all this is to say there's a layer of regime security that push countries like Vietnam and Cambodia who want to, on the hand, hedge against Vietnam by being closer to China. But there's also another level of politics at play at the domestic level in which at crucial moments can affect foreign policy.
That's a sophisticated enough answer to be able to play in Australia, in the kind of granular analysis one needs to understand the dynamics. But follow up with one brief question. Do you think both Vietnam and Cambodia see ASEAN as a central part of their foreign policies going forward?
I do believe that both see ASEAN as a forum, an institution that needs to be sustained and that needs to be in place, and that they both evidently continue to engage with it seriously. But at the same time, I do not think that ASEAN is the only, or if not the main institution to which these institutions kind of navigate their relationship with China and the US. In fact, throughout this today I heard the word diversification a lot in all kind of ways, what is in trade, but diversification applies here too, politically, for Vietnam, for Cambodia. They diversify politically by, have no problem. There's no fundamental dissonance or kind of contradiction when you see Vietnam forming comprehensive strategic partnership with the U.S. And at the same time maintaining the relationship with China, and continue to do so and expand it, right, way beyond kind of ASEAN, as well as narrow regime type partnerships.
One build on for a Canadian audience. What can Canada learn from Vietnam about how to live with China?
What can Canada learn how to live with China? I think
I wasn't expecting this question.
I was not. So as part of an ongoing dialogue, I think, which is that to be multilateral in the sense that it doesn't put all of its eggs in one basket. if I can, that's all right. It doesn't necessarily engage on multiple facets of relationship. Not narrowly economic trade on one hand, not narrowly politically in terms of just strictly regime-driven kind of politics. I only engage with one type of partners, but not the other. But to be very, in some way, flexible. And yet it does very well also in narrating its rationale for doing so. And the one way to kind of how to navigate relationship with China is China could feel threatened, right? When Vietnam is all of a sudden expanding its reach by forming all these partnerships with countries like the US and Australia and Japan and South Korea. But Vietnam took the step to communicate, engage with China still, right? However you want to look at it, positively and negatively, but the fact is that it does so. And that assurance, that communication assures China, right? I don't know what goes on behind the door, but that is one effective way, I would argue, in which it managed to play multiple sides.
Well, thank you. I was afraid you were going to recommend that Canada elect a Communist Party to manage relations. But on a more serious note, Kai Ostwald is the director of the Institute of Asian Research at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs in Vancouver, UBC, and has become something of the kind of dean of Southeast Asian organizational activities at the university level across the country. So he's informed, but he also is one of these people who lives on airplanes and has spent a great deal of time going back and forth. By the way, a geographic advantage for Vancouver in your travel schedule, and has just returned from a very interesting meeting in Malaysia focused on the deepening crisis in Myanmar and what are some of Malaysian ideas on how to move on this. So you may help us with that one in a moment, Kai. But take a step back, because you've been involved with Indo-Pacific strategy discussions in Ottawa, across the country with the scholarly, and you have a pretty good feel of the vibe. What should the IPS be paying special attention to in the context of Southeast Asia and ASEAN?
Thank you, Paul. And your reference to airplane gives me shudders. Let me start by reminding this room of converts. You wouldn't be spending your Tuesday here if you didn't recognize the intrinsic importance of the Indo-Pacific, of why so much of the world is focusing its attention and efforts onto courting Southeast Asia. It's a region of almost 700 million people. It's the fastest growing region in the world economically by a number of metrics. Its demographic structure positions it well to continue that at least for 2 decades, if not 3 decades into the future. And it's not just a question of being part of that economic growth story that attracts other countries, including Canada, but it's also what Southeast Asia has to offer in terms of economic security, the kind of issues that came up frequently in the first two panels today on access to critical minerals, on, for example, supply chain diversification. On all of those fronts, there is a clear value proposition in Southeast Asia. And I think if we look at the 2 years of the Indo-Pacific strategy thus far in Canada, we recognize there is a lot more activity. I made a tour of much of the region this summer, connecting with our missions, and each of the missions can rattle off a list of all the new things that they're doing. And these are all important because they show Canada to be an active and engaged partner at this moment, and a partner that has real ambitions in the region, as articulated by the strategy itself. That said, there are fundamental challenges that remain that have not yet been addressed by the strategy, nor by what Canada has done in the first 2 years. And the first that you will hear repeatedly around Southeast Asia is a question of whether Canada is as committed as the Indo-Pacific strategy suggests it is. Right? There is a history of being an active partner in Southeast Asia, only for a retreat to happen when political winds shift. And there were repeated questions from government, from industry across Southeast Asia about what the anticipated election in Canada means, right? What would a conservative government think about the Indo-Pacific, about Southeast Asia? How would its priorities change? Underlying that is the fear that the commitment expressed is maybe not as durable as suggested. The second of the major challenges is that Canada has remained somewhat ambiguous on exactly what its interests in Southeast Asia are, right? What its objectives are. Obviously, economic growth, economic security are key, but that's very high level. When we get into the details beyond that, how does Canada position itself? What are its broader security interests? How does it deal with what is an incredibly diverse region across or set of regions across the Indo-Pacific? And I think the real challenge that we face with those questions is that we are going to face real and challenging new headwinds following the election of Donald Trump in the US. That has a number of dimensions to it. As we are all aware, Trump has vowed and sees himself as having a mandate to disrupt the global economic system as we know it. And of course, despite what we heard this morning, whether or not tariffs and other trade disruptions constitute an existential threat to Canada, there certainly is the perception that the threat is existential to key sectors. And we need to remember, even a 1 or 2 or 3% downturn in GDP growth has real political repercussions that many political leaders are unwilling to accept without action. And I fear that Canada will direct a lot of attention, its top talent, its top thinkers, more resources towards the United States at a time when it is just ramping up its activities across the Indo-Pacific. There's the defense component. It's almost certain that Trump will push for 2% defense expenditure. Those are resources that are not floating around in Ottawa. They'll need to be redirected from elsewhere. But then there's also the much broader issue of a fundamental tension between the way that Trump, with what looks like a set of advisors who are quite hawkish on China, views the world and views the Indo-Pacific particularly through the lens of security. That is a worldview that does not resonate very well across Southeast Asia, as both Elina and Noor noted. Across Southeast Asia, despite its political diversity, despite its economic and cultural diversity, there is uniformly a commitment to democracy, to the other D, to development as a top priority. And as we've heard from some regional leaders, Jokowi put this nicely sometimes, what are Indonesia's top 3 priorities? Development, and development, and development. Right? Foreign policy is often in service of facilitating that development. There is no clear ideological component to it across the region, and what you will consistently hear from both leaders and industry is that Southeast Asia is friends to all and does not feel comfortable with the way, for example, the Indo-Pacific strategy in Canada and the United States portrays China as a fundamental threat to global order. Right? That's not to say that Southeast Asia doesn't recognize challenge from an assertive China. It certainly does, right? But it does not see confrontation of the kind and the securitization of that challenge as a solution to dealing with an increasingly assertive and increasingly influential China, right? And that's a challenge to Canada, as it will be pressured to align increasingly with the priorities of the United States, under the threat almost certainly of specified and unspecified penalties. Right? So what does that mean for Canada? I think we have a lot of things we can talk about in the next half hour. I'm certainly in no position to prescribe solutions, but in having toured the region and having spoken to many people, one thing I think that Canada clearly can do better is tell the Canadian story better to the general public across the Indo-Pacific. Who is Canada? We had a speaker this morning allude to the very shallow knowledge of what Canada constitutes. Polar bears, ice hockey. There are more Tim Hortons across Southeast Asia, so there's a little bit of flag waving there. But on that front as well, it is up to Canadians to some extent and Canadian institutions to demonstrate who they are. Right? It's striking in Manila, for example. I spoke to quite a number of taxi drivers and asked them if they know TELUS. They said, yes, of course. TELUS, a big company here. Where's TELUS from? And the response is, well, it's like Telephone US, no? An American company. No awareness that it was Canadian, right? So there is a lot of relatively easy work to be done in demonstrating all of the ways that Canada is active already. And many of the development programs aren't recognized in part because there isn't the same brand recognition that CETA once provided. There's also a need, I think, to speak to counterparts in government in a different way and articulate exactly what Canada's interests are. And this is challenging because I think, as came out from Nu's comments and Elina's comments, Southeast Asia is complex, and it is a difficult place to come to with a one-size-fits-all set of ideas, set of solutions, right? But there is a real critical need to articulate what Canada's value proposition is, how it fits into this increasingly challenging geopolitical climate, in particular with all of the uncertainties south of the border.
Let me, excuse me, let me put to you a proposition that was given to me at a recent meeting in Malaysia, with reference to Canada and its new alignment in a direction of the Indo-Pacific and what our particular strategy was. And you remember back, 15 years ago, there was an argument that Australia was the deputy sheriff of the United States in the region. The deputy sheriff, and my witty Malaysian counterpart said, well, yeah, but Canada isn't like that. You may be the deputy sheriff, but you don't have bullets. I was never sure if that meant we needed a bigger defense capability to be part of the picture. But is it, Canada is going to be aligned with the United States. How important is it for us to emphasize in Southeast Asia that we are not perfectly aligned with the United States, and where might that be best practiced?
This is a big question that we could break up into many parts, but let me just answer it very briefly by saying I think one of Canada's strongest assets in Southeast Asia is that it is not the United States and it is not China. It is an alternative to both of those two actors, and there is a lot of hope that on key dimensions, it doesn't have to be all dimensions, that Canada acts in a somewhat autonomous manner.
For example?
I love to join in this conversation as well. Something that I've heard from groups that I visited this summer in Cambodia is that Cambodia tell us, on the one hand, what can we do in order for the U.S. to not withdraw from Cambodia due to change political climate in Cambodia, not the D word, but the opposite of the D word. Can I say that? A change in leadership and regime in Cambodia. But on the other hand, the second most important question that we were asked was, what can we do to attract, to get other countries to engage, to come to Cambodia? Canada wasn't mentioned among those countries. EU was mentioned, right? Canada should be one of the countries that also on the mindset, on that list, for instance, right? And also in other ways, one of the complaints I heard was, or concerned, was that the U.S. has withdrawn engagement or aid or assistance to various civil society groups or altogether in Cambodia due to, again, political climate in Cambodia. But this has also made it very difficult for groups that would normally actually be supporters and advocates of many initiatives, including economic and human security issues initiatives, that environmental, climate change, right? That Canada cares about, that the US cares about. And yet, they're not able to do their work and to support, to build a synergy. So that is another aspect, kind of pocket in which Canada can also engage in place of the US.
Boy, that reminds me, excuse me, of the cooperative security and human security agenda, which is very difficult to pursue at this stage, but worth noting. Elina, I'm going to come back to you in a minute on this one, on your thoughts for Canadians, because we consider you about 1/10 Canadian in your time through the foundation. But I want to cue some other people up who are in the room. There are a variety of people here who have been representatives in different Southeast Asian countries. There's the head of a foundation that is launching a major venture in Southeast Asia, headquartered in Singapore. And I'd like you guys to go to the microphone when you can. And no promotions. We're not selling anything here, but we're trying to see what we can do that differentiates Canada, put some resources into that. And either whether it's in individual countries or whether it's in ASEAN itself. I'll make a pitch for ASEAN in a few minutes. But Elina, let's start you first, and then I'm going to start looking at people in the room, hoping you'll be going to the microphones on this one of think a little bit prescriptively about what's going on. And Elina, you get the last chance on this one before we turn to the floor.
Thank you. I'm just going to piggyback on Noor's points about values and ideology. And I think Kai also alluded to this. The aversion to engaging with certain countries in Southeast Asia, whether it's the US or Canada or elsewhere, is problematic for a number of reasons. One, because Southeast Asia itself doesn't really see any value superiority between one major power and another. And I think we've seen many, many instances of hypocrisy on the issue of human rights, on the issue of democracy, on the issue of other aspects of political ideology that undercuts a lot of this resistance or reluctance to engage with Southeast Asian countries on that very basis. And so I wonder if Canada in particular will be able to get over that hang up of engaging with countries on an issues basis instead of on a values basis, as other countries have done. And if so, I think it can be a more productive and constructive relationship that can be built with even the countries that Canada doesn't interact with as much. That said, I will happily welcome the 1/10 Canadian side of me, because I actually did play ice hockey competitively in university.
That's right. Okay, great. Let's, I mean, there's 20 different directions we can go in this conversation, but let's see what we can come up with prescriptively. I'm going to ask our panelists, too, to give a little bit of thought on this matter of fragmentation to thinking about Indonesia and where it's going under a new leadership, which may be either a strengthening of ASEAN, or there's some signs that Indonesia is going to play a role commensurate with its size and move beyond ASEAN. But I'll put Indonesia in the back of everybody's mind and call on Jeff Nankerveld. Jeff is the president and CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. And if we don't get it right over the next 3 years under his leadership, he should be impeached. So, President Nankerveld.
No pressure. Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks to the panelists. I lost my voice at a function last night. So what I'm going to talk about briefly really picks up on what Kai and Elina have just been talking about. So at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, we're a national not-for-profit institution established by an act of parliament in 1984, headquartered in Vancouver. We identified a few years ago the specific challenge that Canada has had in Southeast Asia, which is what I would call the problem of mind share. That we simply, for understandable historical and geographic reasons, we are not that well known. Canada, Canadians and their institutions, their firms, organizations are not that well known in that part of the world. And the good news, and that's not just from anecdotal evidence, the foundation has actually commissioned surveys of business leaders in Southeast Asia that identify this very specifically. Basically, that there is a lot of goodwill towards Canada, and Canada, even today, in spite of what you might think and hear, that Canada still enjoys a very good reputation. The Canadian brand is very strong, but people in the region, decision makers in the region, simply don't know much about Canada, as Kai identified. And so this is a problem of mind share. The good news is that is an addressable problem. And one of the things you can do to address it is to put some resources into, which are modest on the national scheme of things. It doesn't compare with defense budget requirements, but to put some resources into addressing that issue. So we put forward an initiative which is now being funded by the federal government through Global Affairs Canada through a grant over 5 years, a regional initiative with a primary focus on Southeast Asia. We have a secondary focus, which was introduced partway through the development of this, on South Asia, particularly India, for reasons that I think would be well understood. But the primary focus on Southeast Asia. And the idea is to stand up a whole suite of new programs that include the convening of events, roundtables, dialogues, on a bilateral basis, but also on a Canada-ASEAN basis. Support things around understanding the CPTPP, which we'll have a session on shortly, and improve understanding of that. Fellowships of different kinds for scholars, for kind of distinguished fellows from across the region, as well as journalists through media fellowships, and emerging leaders through a new emerging leaders program. And the aim of all of this is, on the one hand, to just get Canadians and their ideas and their capabilities in front of people who matter in Southeast Asia, and to do it on a regular, consistent basis in a way that we have not done previously. At the same time, and I would say of pretty much equal importance, is to bring the voices and perspectives of the region to the attention of Canadians. And this is coming at a time when there is organically a broad range of curiosity in Canada. We see it definitely in the business community very strongly. And if you followed the trade missions last week to Indonesia and the Philippines, there is a genuine interest. The corporate sector is putting real resources into exploring opportunities in Southeast Asia. So at a time when Canadians and their firms and institutions and organizations are looking to diversify and explore opportunities, that's precisely when we need to be creating the forums and the mechanisms through which Canadians can really listen before we talk and understand the perspectives of the leading thinkers and doers from the region. And in connection with that, we are also establishing an office in Singapore that will be open in a couple of months from now, and we'll have a small complement of staff based in Singapore who will then work with some people we'll engage in a few other places, including Jakarta, to work with ASEAN and its secretariat, as well as Bangkok as a regional hub and someone in Delhi. And I'll just close, Paul, and in a factual rather than promotional spirit, to mention a concrete example of what I'm talking about is the Canada and Asia conferences, which we started convening in February of 2023, then February of 2024, and we'll have another one coming up in February of 2025, the 19th to the 21st. This is in Singapore, same time each year, same place, and basically we work with the Canadian universities to invite their alumni from all over the region. We bring together business leaders from Canada and Asia, chambers of commerce, the Canadian bilateral chambers from around the region, business associations, and corporate leaders from Asia, as well as government institutions from Canada at the three levels of government, some of whom are here today. And we've been averaging around 500 participants each time. The things that I'm talking about and that Kai is talking about and Elina's talking about are, in a sense, untested. Like, we don't know if we set the table for Canadians to travel to the region regularly. It is very expensive to go there, and in both time and obviously money. But I think this is doing the necessary, is to set the table, to get people to come and to keep coming back at the same time as we will be bringing people from the region here.
I ask you to add one more sentence. What you described would have been a perfect strategy in the Asia-Pacific era. What it doesn't address is the geopolitics of where Canada is going to be positioning on China and managing relations with the United States. What is the political security dimension of this new vision?
Well, I think the political security dimension of it is, as Kai was saying, we need to get Canadian thinkers on these issues and Canadian policymakers on these issues to the region, particularly to Southeast Asia, to be engaged in ongoing conversations and not have policies that are only informed by what people can read sitting in Ottawa or by traveling to Washington. It's a topic for another day, but the Asia-Pacific versus Indo-Pacific, I don't see that as central to every single issue that we're discussing around this. This is also something that we could have been doing and should have been doing for decades, and I think the imperative for diversification of our connections in the political and security and defense sphere, as in the trade and civil society spheres, is something that is just a smart thing for us to be doing. So I think we will be better positioned vis-a-vis both the US and China the more we can develop these relationships, which are, at the end of the day, person to person. Then they become institution to institution by getting Canadians, including people in the defense sector and security analysts and so on, in regular conversations with counterparts and peers from the region, both the senior level but also at the emerging level. That's the answer.
Thank you, President Nankerveld. And then former High Commissioner Bentley. Julia Bentley is a Malaysian voice as well as a China voice. What is your wisdom, Ms. Bentley?
Well, I actually have a question. So I would like to commend the panelists for sharing their perspectives with us. And I found great value in a number of the comments. One that particularly stuck with me was the importance of engagement based on issues rather than values. And the question specifically that I would like to ask relates to some of the things that Elina said about Malaysia's chairpersonship of ASEAN in 2025. And for example, ASEAN's engagement with the Gulf Cooperation Council as ASEAN as an institution, as a grouping. My question is about engagement by ASEAN individual countries in BRICS. And specifically, my understanding is that 4 ASEAN countries have indicated their interest in joining the BRICS. And the aspirations are not just economically related, but also related to sustainable development. So the question is, to what extent should we understand, we in Canada, that do have some interests in sustainable development, should we understand that these ASEAN countries are hoping that the BRICS will provide practical assistance in terms of things like development, as the Indonesian former president said, development, and in relation to green transformation? So I'm not addressing my question to any of you individually, because I anticipate that each of you might have something to say on that, but for reasons of economy of time, I'll let you choose who'll answer it.
Elina, do you want to try that first?
Sure. So interestingly, I haven't really heard much commentary about sustainable development driving countries' interest, ASEAN countries' interest in BRICS. Depending on who you ask and in which country, you're going to get different answers, as I'm sure you're well aware. So I've heard, for example, with Indonesia, there was some, not disagreement, but there were some differences in opinion among different agencies in government about whether Indonesia should actually pursue full membership of BRICS versus its interest in the OECD, for example. In Malaysia's case, I think the government sees participation in BRICS now as a partner country as a way to get its voice across in a different forum. It's an economic forum, yes, but it's also a geopolitical platform, potentially, if Malaysia is able to present a more active or proactive voice through BRICS. For Thailand and Vietnam, there are also, I think, similar considerations, so not necessarily the same. I don't think BRICS is in a position to provide concrete, substantial practical assistance in sustainable development, barring a few countries within that BRICS grouping. But I think many Southeast Asian countries are beginning to see the value, again, of diversifying their geopolitical options in a multilateral fashion.
If I can just briefly add on to Elina's thoughts there, which I wholeheartedly agree with. From the conversations I had, my sense is that the interest in BRICS is not driven by deliberate strategy or with the expectation of clear outcomes on things like sustainability or development. Rather, they are a symptom of a growing tide of frustration with perceived Western institutions and a desire to open up greater engagement on the South-South horizon, right? So I think whether it's Malaysia or Indonesia, this is a manifestation of a much broader desire to see a different looking world, one that is not as anchored by Western institutions.
I would just want to add a comment about development assistance. One insight that I gained was that on the ground, there are many actors kind of navigating the space and at work in Southeast Asia. In terms of development assistance, there's a perception that different development assistance country providers seems to kind of have developed certain specialized niche. There's a perception that USAID is good at capacity building, and then JICA from Japan is infrastructure, and then KOICA from South Korea is kind of other kind of smaller scale soft education, for example, assistance. And it's not clear whether they actually coordinate actively, deliberately coordinate with one another, or if that somehow just happens. But it raises the questions for me of whether or not such a coordination would be something that is feasible and or productive in terms of talking with one another and finding areas in which to facilitate such sustainable development assistance.
Let's turn back to the microphone and Sawar Kashimi, who is the director of the Polaris project in the United States, which focuses on U.S.-China interactions, and he also likes to talk about Southeast Asia sometimes as well. Sawar, please.
Thank you, Paul. So my question has to be with something that both Kai and my friend Elina touched on, and that is the relationship between Canada going forward, Southeast Asia, ASEAN. And one of the issues that hasn't come up is the so-called, not so-called, the Global South, which is starting to exert its own influence. And I want to take a specific example about the difficulties of separating, if that is what this group is thinking about, the foreign policy from America's not completely welded. And I'm thinking about Ukraine and Russia, Russian war against Ukraine. It's been widely portrayed in America, in Europe, and I think in Canada, as a fight between authoritarianism and democracy. But none of the Southeast states, none of the largest democracies in the world support that view or the sanctions. India, Malaysia, Indonesia, Mexico, on and on and on. How does one bridge that gap if you're advising the Canadian Foreign Ministry? Thanks.
Well, you can feel free to answer a question as well if you'd like.
You know, this is going to be a tremendously difficult issue at any time, is how we balance our values and our interests, and how we manage our absolutely primordial relationship with the United States. And this is an awkward time because, as Kai mentioned, we don't quite know where the United States is going to go on its balance of values and interests under a Trump administration. But we face huge choices in this matter, and so far most of our decisions, partly driven by the Canadian public and in tune with Canadian media thinking, we can't check our values at the door. There's a large number of Canadians who feel that authoritarianism versus democracy is not just something that some Americans in the Biden administration push for, but they think they're right. That in essence we have a deputy prime minister who's given the most important speech on Canadian foreign policy in the current liberal regime, where she divided the world into democracy and authoritarians, and that we need to see this permeating in many areas. I would say I just came from a meeting of the NATO Parliamentary Association, and I would say of the 400 delegates who were there, 200 of them believe that the war in Ukraine is fundamentally about authoritarianism versus democracy. And now that's in the European theater, but they feel that it is now a signal with China supporting Russia that we are into an era where the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific theater is disappearing. It is increasingly becoming one theater defined by democracies versus authoritarians. And in that, it fits with a China that is on the wrong side of that divide. So I wish we could talk this away. I have a fear, or at least a prediction, that if there is a change of regime in Canada, I'm not suggesting a Korean-style coup. But if there is a change in our next election, I cannot imagine how the ideology dimension of the underlying premise of your proposition, that the underlying premise is going to get any weaker. And that puts us much more deeply aligned with a Cold War mindset on what is emerging and where we position ourselves. If it's a good one. You might want to go to the microphone and, should we do this?
So I speak often at West Point and the U.S. Army War College. And Tom Sherlock, one of the famous professors from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, on Polaris Live said, I really hope that we had not described this as authoritarianism versus democracy. Now here is one of the leading military installations, one of the leading professors. I only offer that to say, I think Canada, it's going to be so difficult that I wish you luck. Half my family lives here, so
Was that person who gave you the question Donald Trump? Donald Trump on this one is quite interesting. That's not quite his worldview frame. It's competitive states and issues. So there are some Americans, we're not suggesting it's one-dimensional. But it's a debate in our country that we are silent on at this moment. Can you have a debate when you're silent? Just a second. That metaphor ran out of steam midway. But we are not discussing it. Last point.
Last point is, I agree with what you said, Paul, about that we should not check our values at wherever the we, right? Whatever. But on the other hand, from Southeast Asian countries' perspective, the frame of authoritarianism versus democracy has not actually been productive and effective in actually advancing its goal. And I think that's an important point to recognize. And even Vietnam, right? It has been different. It has also waxed and waned in terms of its receptivity, in terms of on where it lines up in terms of democratic values, despite being a consistently single-party regime. And so by having this very binary focal land of the world, particularly when it applies to Southeast Asia, such a complex, diverse region, it's made, I think it could be very counterproductive instead.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and then we'll do a sum up. Sean Noreen from St. Thomas University, who's been one of the longest serving observers and critics of Canadian policy on Southeast Asia, even in the Asia-Pacific era, as well as the Indo-Pacific. Professor Noreen.
Narayan, actually, but I won't correct you. Actually, I'm glad you said that, because I have to say, and this isn't directed at anyone in particular, I'm astounded at Canadian hypocrisy. The idea that we're talking about values as we watch what's happening in Gaza is fantastic. It's amazing. But that being said, I have lots of questions, but I realized Paul will cut me off, one. So I'm looking at the State of Southeast Asia 2024, and the survey asks, one of the questions it asks is, if Southeast Asians are forced to choose between the United States and China, where would you go? Who would you choose? And by 1%, for the first time in this survey, it's been done for 6 years, the Southeast Asians chose China. And this was, under Biden, so I suspect the next time they ask the question under Trump, it might be significantly larger. And of course, this was a significant decline from the year before, where it was about a 60-40 split in favor of the U.S. Does that mean anything? I mean, putting aside questions of methodology, does it mean anything to you that Southeast Asian elites would say, if we had to choose, we would go with China? Is that just purely being pragmatic?
Elina, what do you think?
So I think the context to this was the questions, the whole survey was conducted against the backdrop of the genocide in Gaza. And so you saw a significant turn in opinion, and that's reflected in the survey as well. I think it's a question on Gaza. And so I think part of the explanation for why Southeast Asians would, quote unquote, choose China over the US is explained by that contextual background. Of course, the other explanation, and there are many explanations I think that you can pull from different countries, is that, yeah, I mean, I mentioned in my remarks earlier, different Southeast Asian countries are going to turn to different powers for different reasons at different times. And this goes back to my earlier point about this being one of those times where there's been, I think, particularly amongst countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, significant eye-opening in terms of the hypocrisy of the United States in its advocacy of values, etc., that have come to light. So it's pragmatism, but it's also, I think, a very different worldview now that we've seen over the past year in particular with what is going on in a different part of the world.
Right.
You're not on.
Could I? There we go. I think Elina's absolutely right, but I also think it's important that we don't overinterpret that finding, because what it suggests is that there is a preference for China, and I think what it reflects, as Elina said, is a growing frustration at perceived hypocrisy of the US, at perceived failure of Western institutions. But it's important to point out, in Southeast Asia, there is no interest in any external power dominating. There's no more interest in China dominating Southeast Asia than there is in the United States dominating Southeast Asia, right? So that's the limit of how we interpret that question.
Question, I would have it, but no. Go on. Sorry.
No, I would just add to Kai's comment, is that another feedback that I received is that, for instance, aid provided by the US come with constraints or expectations, deliverables, right? Whereas from China, a lot of time it's no string attached.
Well, we are at time, and the organizers of the conference asked us, we could have focused on many different sub-regions of the Indo-Pacific world. This meeting could have been on China, this could have been on India, it could have been on Korea and Japan, the Northeast Asian countries. But I think what we heard in the discussion from our presentations is reflective of the different kind of discourse in Southeast Asia around issues than we frequently run into if we're in Korea, if we're in Japan, when we're in the context of different kinds of regimes. And in that sense, it makes Southeast Asia more important, because Southeast Asia, in some respects, is a part, or at least a fellow traveler, of the global South. And in the division of the world as we're moving, we're going to, the strategic narrative is shifting. We no longer determine that strategic narrative. The United States is a crucial player, essential to our future, but it is only one narrative. And I think, to draw on Jeff Nankervel's point, we need again a generation of Canadians who spend a lot of time talking to Southeast Asians. Not to say they shouldn't talk to Koreans or to Chinese, but Southeast Asians, because of the complexities of their views and their desires for prosperity and their desire to find a way to get out of this geopolitical competition that is going to hurt them as it hurts us. They don't have the answers yet, but they have some nudges in directions that certainly I hope Canada can learn more from, more with in the meetings to come. So I would second the comment that was made earlier this morning to thank the IPD, the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, for organizing meetings that are occasionally a little bit orthogonal to mainstream thinking in Ottawa. They keep us on our toes, and I think bringing Southeast Asia into that discussion is part of the process. So an applause, please, for our panelists, but also for the IPD and what they've been doing. Thank you, Ms. Noor.